The world is old. Very old. Old as balls. Just when you think you're done digging up the old stuff, bam! There's more old stuff underneath it. It can be hard to really grasp what that ancientness means, so let's try and build up our awareness of it one step at a time, starting small, with ourselves. We have wants and needs and frustrations that are unique to us and to our situation. We've experienced good things and bad things, heartbreaks and joy, private things we don't share with anyone else. Frequently, we don't fully understand why we feel the way we feel, or what's going on inside our heads. We might react to things in unexpected ways, or realize we've changed from who we thought we were when we weren't looking. We contain an infinitely complex inner world, and sometimes it feels like instead of being the master of the domain, we're just trying to bushwhack through it. So that's one person. One person is already infinitely complex and rich. Now let's integrate on that. Every person is exactly that complex and rich. Right at this very minute, the world is full of literally innumerable complications. Billions of people are living different lives, navigating different spaces and challenges, wanting different things and pursuing different goals. Everyone has shared experiences, but no two people are wholly alike, and so their lives and experiences are uniquely complicated. And once we get a handle on this vast complexity just in this singular moment we're all sharing, we can then extend this awareness back in time and realize that every minute of the past 300,000 years has also been full of innumerably complicated human lives. And we can start to get an inkling for how truly enormous and fractally complex the breadth of human history really is. But this integral is too big for us to think about for very long. Frankly, just being aware of how everyone else in the world right now is a complete human being just as complicated as we are is a tall order. Because if it weren't a tall order, it'd be a lot easier for people to be nice to customer service workers, and also I think war probably wouldn't exist. Anyway, extending that awareness back through over 100 billion human lives that lived in versions of the world we can't even imagine risks tipping into Lovecraftian madness territory. If we get down into the nitty-gritty details, even one human life contains too much complexity to fully understand. Even if it's our own life. We can know the vastness and depth of history numerically without really having the bandwidth to feel it. But what we can understand a little more easily is that history was made of people just like us. We can't completely understand them, but we can find common ground with them. They lived one day at a time, laughed and cried and made connections with each other, woke up from unsatisfying naps and took some mondo dumps. We don't need to understand every complexity and every detail to recognize familiarity. Now when it comes to fiction, no made-up world can ever match the organic fractal complexity of reality, where everything just becomes more complicated the deeper in you go. But what fiction can do is make an approximation of what those complexities look like in the broadest strokes, and leave it to their infinitely complex audience to infer the appropriate levels of infinite complexity into the framework they're given. So when a story wants to communicate that the world is ancient and has seen countless complete lives come and go in a nearly incomprehensible abyss of time itself, they might do this efficiently by creating the Precursors. Now, the Precursors is the trope name for a lost ancient civilization that died out, fizzled out, tapped out to slumber for deathless eons, or just moved on to other stuff until their descendants became completely disconnected from their own ancient past. Precursors are great for punching up a setting with mysterious ruins and lost technology, and they add a lot of depth and age to a world by implying a wealth of ancient complexity that the writer doesn't have to actually show in any significant detail on screen. Precursors can also be used to justify a lot of otherwise very complicated world building, especially in sci-fi settings, by simply having been so advanced that they were capable of achieving things that are now impossible for the main characters and their civilization of choice. This is a very useful get-out-of-explaining-free tool for a writer to have. There are certain genre conventions of sci-fi that just kind of don't hold up to a high school curriculum's level of scrutiny. Things like faster-than-light travel, higher spatial dimensions, and large numbers of habitable planets with human-like aliens on them. Things that make sci-fi fun and adventurous, and very much not how real space works. If a writer is in a hand-wavy mood, they can just credit any and all of these things to a highly advanced precursor civilization with technology beyond the comprehension of modern science. So it's okay if we have FTL drives, we don't need to explain how they work because the people currently using them also don't understand how they work. And it's okay if aliens are basically just humans in fun makeup and they even have DNA like ours and can maybe even reproduce with humans, which is beyond the scope of unlikely. Maybe a precursor just went around seeding planets with some prototype DNA and everything in the galaxy is basically cousins. This sort of thing lets the writers include whatever bonkers stuff they want without having to also include complex ramifications of the characters being able to make or do that bonkers stuff whenever they want. Basically, if a writer wants to include something in the world that was clearly crafted intentionally by someone but is far beyond the capabilities of any of the people in the story to preserve some semblance of power scaling and challenge for the leads, one of the easiest ways to explain it is by hand-waving it as the work of some ancient precursor precursor that did it for them. We need FTL travel, but we want our characters to be basically modern humans from modern Earth. Okay, FTL travel was made by ancient precursors and nobody on Earth understands how it works. We need a hard magic system governed by a language of magic that clearly can't have just spawned out of the ether. Okay, maybe it's the language that was spoken by the ancient precursors who created the magic system and might have also been dragons or something. I think this is more common in sci-fi settings than fantasy ones, because when a fantasy setting needs to contrive world building, it can usually just say that the gods did it that way. They're basically filling the same function as ancient precursors without leaving behind nifty ruins and highly advanced tech most of the time. This is, however, one of the easiest ways to work in automatons or machinery in a fantasy setting that otherwise does not have it. It's just the ancient work of an ancient precursor civilization that figured out how gears work and then exploded or something. By their very nature, the precursors usually just shape the setting and background of the world they're in. They're strictly past tense, and since they can't generally actively participate in the story, their influence is limited to just providing set pieces and plot devices for the characters to deal with, and how that influence plays out can vary a lot and depend on what they left behind. The concept of the precursors is pretty vague, but one major factor in the vibes of a given precursor civilization is the question of what exactly happened to them. Most real-world ancient civilizations didn't end overnight. Wars and disasters are common, but total extinction is very rare. Civilizations in a given location will usually just sort of peter out as the environment stops being ideal for sustaining the needs of the population, with later generations abandoning unused buildings or migrating to more ideal locations, leaving formerly useful construction to lapse into a ruined state. This sort of slow transformation from one civilization to another is probably the most common way a society can end in the real world, but it's very rare in fiction, probably because it's complicated and boring. The precursors are designed to be an open question mark in the world, a place where people used to be but aren't anymore. There's questions implicit in that and answers hidden in the designs of the ruins, the function of the technology, the records that might have survived. This is also something that appeals to real-world archaeologists, treating the past like an endlessly deep stack of mysteries to solve. But writers can build their worlds to make these mysteries appealingly dramatic and clear-cut in a way that's not common in real-world history. So when the question of what happened to the precursors comes up, there's usually a pretty short list of answers. The easiest answer, of course, being no one knows. This is the basic open-ended option that essentially leaves the remnants of the precursors to just speak for themselves. There are cool ruins, fancy relics, maybe a writing system nobody can read to preserve the mystery. You can use the ruins for background set dressing or to store some MacGuffin the heroes need to find. These precursors only contribute to the story by making a bunch of stuff for it to play with, which is totally respectable and saves the writer from having to world build their society in any meaningful way. As a bonus, if the writer wants, they can also choose to include one or two isolated survivors of this mysteriously vanished people. Since one or two people do not make a society, they can be peppered in comparative isolation without appreciably raising the writer's world-building costs, as long as they're not interested in explaining the details of how their people used to work. The vagueness of these precursors can lend itself to anything from general melancholy at the inexorable passage of time to existential eldritch horror if it's indicated that their mysterious unknown fate was the result of some incomprehensible bullshit that got them blipped out of existence or something. And on the subject of eldritch horror, another way to answer the core question is the self-explanatory: the precursors are still around, and that's a problem. This is common when the precursors are unaging godlike entities who left their works behind or maybe got sealed away instead of dying out. These precursors get to double up as antagonists, frequently bundled as a package deal with their ancient ruins and cool technology because they were being stored in the same place. So our heroes get to reap the benefits of cool ruins exploration and highly advanced technology, along with a fun cabal of profoundly powerful and dangerous problem precursors. However, since the precursors are usually defined as having been incomprehensibly powerful and capable of feats that no modern science or technology can match, the presence of actively dangerous surviving precursors risks being an unsolvable problem. Sometimes this is the point of them, as is the general vibe of most classic Lovecraftian horror. The entire point of the nightmare fuel is that the old ones are so beyond human power and comprehension that we are as ants before them and humanity is profoundly insignificant in the face of the old gods. But in more traditional storytelling structures with protagonists and antagonists and actually achievable goals, the problem precursors can probably be finagled away in a few seasons of hard work and heroic gumption. On the other end of the problem spectrum, some precursors are gone because they became so advanced that they left the planet or ascended to another plane of existence or became energy beings or something similarly incomprehensible. These precursors usually leave behind ludicrously advanced tech, which the characters have to clumsily stumble through figuring out even the basic features of, like me when I'm handed a non-touchscreen phone. These precursors almost never show up in any meaningful way, possibly due to a Prime Directive-style no-interference clause with unenlightened physical life forms, and this is basically just another way to conveniently sweep them off the board and leave behind all their coolest stuff. It also plants this interesting idea in the substrate of the story, that civilization is a linear process of development and growth with an end goal in the form of what amounts to a game over screen. The precursors won, and their reward was some sort of incomprehensible godlike ascension. If our current civilization follows their example, maybe we get to do the same thing. This is one of the only precursor versions where it's kind of implied that nothing bad happened, because nothing bad had time to happen after after they achieved their win condition and got taken off the board. Civilizations left to run indefinitely might achieve some kind of cultural victory by building themselves into a utopic golden age, with the obligatory caveat that very few supposed utopias are actually built to be utopic for everyone in them, but even golden ages are dependent on fallible people and an environment that can physically sustain their needs. The victory doesn't last forever, and they'll almost always either collapse into a less idyllic arrangement or just transform to become unrecognizable. In the story of real history, victory doesn't end the story on a high note because the story doesn't end. But these stories posit that if you just civilization good enough, you'll win so hard you can stop dealing with reality at all. Oh, wait a minute, this is just the Rapture in a weird hat. But far more common than any of these are the stories where the precursor civilization was destroyed by some calamity, often the wrath of the gods. A lot of these borrow heavily from the Platonic dialogue on Atlantis, which is kind of the blueprint for highly advanced lost civilizations, and was famously destroyed by the gods for their hubris. In fact, a shocking number of precursors are just literally Atlantis. In these cases, the precursor civilization collapsed, leaving behind a ton of ruins and fun artifacts, but more notably, unlike the other possibilities we've laid out, these precursors can, and almost always do, also leave behind heirs and descendants. And this is where the precursors start playing a more interesting role in the story. Because precursors that just leave behind ruins and relics are a useful way to spice up a setting and pepper in some fun artifacts for the characters to play with, but precursors that leave behind descendants can facilitate much more complicated stories about legacy and the cycles of history and learning from the mistakes of the past. The structure of these stories is very consistent. Back in a theoretical golden age, a great precursor civilization dominated the world. They thought they were so cool and so amazing and the most powerful thing around, and then something even more powerful crashed out of the ether to remind them of the real shape of the food chain. This might have been divine intervention, a cataclysmic natural disaster, the realization that they've cut themselves off from the things they need to survive, their own advanced technology going awry. The exact shape of it can vary a lot, but it's basically either something that was completely beyond their power to control, or something that was the direct result of their own actions. In the "oh no, not the consequences of my actions" version, the precursors can also potentially contribute one more story element: a problem. Maybe the precursors built a weapon, or genetically engineered a tool, or turned themselves into something wonky, and the unintended consequences didn't just destroy them, they also stuck around to destroy a bunch of other stuff. This has a very fun layer of existential dread that even the Lovecraftian great old ones don't match, because it basically asks the question, if the godlike beings that created this threat couldn't stop it, what are we supposed to do? It's like that philosophical question, could God create a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it? Only the answer is, yeah, and it killed him. It's kind of the worst case scenario answer to the question implicit in the trope, if they were so advanced, what happened to them? And it really communicates the potentially apocalyptic scale of the threat. Whatever the problem is, it already ended one better equipped and better armed civilization, so if our heroes don't figure out how to handle the problem, the good news is, they're not gonna have the problem for long. But this is only an issue for settings where the precursors' downfall outlasts the precursors themselves. That's not always the case, especially in the more Atlantis-inspired ones where the precursors got too hubrisy and exploded about it. Sometimes the only thing the precursors leave behind is a cautionary tale, and a small handful of descendants to take it to heart. Because when you have this kind of precursor, it is almost always the case that at least one main character will turn out to be one of the last descendants of the precursors, frequently a direct heir to the defunct royal family, which they almost all have, and they will be tempted with the possibility of restoring the lost empire to its former glory. It's truly like clockwork. Like, the consistency is very impressive considering this isn't at all a part of the original Platonic dialogues about Atlantis. This might be Tolkien's fault, like a lot of other mainstay fantasy tropes in the genre. It doesn't come up in much detail in The Lord of the Rings, especially not the movies, but Aragorn's one true king status comes in large part from being one of the last descendants of the Númenórean kings, the royal family that ruled the ancient Atlantis-like greatest civilization in the history of ever, until they got too hung up on existential dread and decided to try conquering Valinor and seizing the power of immortality for themselves, whereupon they boofed it so hard that the gods exploded the island and turned the world from flat to round so mortals couldn't try to invade them anymore. But don't worry, Aragorn is descended from the not-stupid part of the family. The lesson to be learned from this precursor downfall is pretty overt. Attempting a military takeover of heaven itself is stupid, and mortal lifespans are a feature and not a bug. Aragorn handily internalizes both of these lessons, so when he becomes king of Gondor, they all have a much better time of it by simply not doing the stupid thing. Since a solid 70% of the fantasy genre is just looking over Tolkien's shoulder and taking notes, it wouldn't surprise me if this is why a lot of precursor heirs are less interested in renewing the ancient empire that is their birthright, and are more focused on questioning what happened to kill it in the first place, and if maybe it shouldn't stay dead. This adds an intriguing second half to the core question, if the precursors were so advanced, what happened to them, in the form of, and can we fix it, and should we fix it? Generally Generally, when the question is, should we try to turn back time to the good old days, most stories come down on the side of no. Clinging to the fading glory of an ancient empire that self-destructed under the weight of its own hubristic appetite is generally seen as real bad guy behavior. But to explore why that's bad, the story needs to get into the weeds of why and how the civilization collapsed in the first place. A civilization that just collapsed from bad luck or a natural disaster doesn't have a moral reason to stay dead, but the vast majority of Atlantis-flavor precursors exploded for entirely avoidable and self-inflicted reasons, and the characters would do well to internalize the lessons of history before trying to do any repeats. So some of these heroes will sort of compromise on the conclusion that remaking the old empire is bad guy behavior, but instead they're going to make a new empire that avoids the ethical and practical problems that nuked the old one. After all, the only reason the precursors exist in the story is to give the characters present depth and context, and there's nothing more rewarding to do with a lesson from history than to try not to repeat it. Sometimes the moral of a precursor story is to let the past stay buried, and sometimes it's to unbury it, take notes about the arrangement of its body, and then try not to die the same way. So, yeah.